The quiet distance did not arrive with a slam. It drifted in like fog, soft and polite, asking for a corner of the room and then claiming the whole window. At first it was barely there. Just the space between two coffee mugs on the table. A silence that used to be laughter, a pause where a kiss would normally live. Work followed him home in the tired set of his shoulders. Sleep followed this heart through every hallway. Nothing dramatic. Nothing loud. Just life, and the gentle belief that vows alone could water the garden. This heart remembers the beginning. Fingers that wouldn't let go at intersections. Messages that felt like campfires on cold nights. Conversations that ran until the battery died and the moon rolled her eyes. There was hunger for everything. Each detail, each story, each ridiculous preference for how the toast should be cut. In those days, love felt like a bright, unstoppable tide. And yet tides turn, even when every promise is sincere. After the ceremony, after the applause, after the last guest slipped away with a pocketed centerpiece, ordinary days set their chairs around the table and asked for attention. Attention turned out to be the most expensive currency. Mornings became a checklist: keys, phone, lunch, deadlines, while the goodbye at the door shrank from a long embrace to a quick nod that said, "Later." Okay? Later became a hallway with no end. Evenings returned us to a home where the television spoke more than the two people who had once planned cities out of nothing but hope. He loved quietly, faithfully, but fatigue carried its own accent, and devotion mumbled through a yawn can sound like disinterest if no one leans closer to hear. There is a kind of loneliness that appears only when companionship is present. It wears familiar sneakers and knows where the spoons are kept. That loneliness moved in, setting books back on the shelf without reading them. This heart tried to pretend not to notice. After all, love isn't fragile, right? Love is strong enough to survive a busy season, 2 busy seasons, a year of busy seasons. That's what everyone says. Love is an oak. But even oaks need rain. The aching realization arrived in small, honest moments. A glance across the living room that met nothing but the reflection of a screen. An anniversary spent making it up next weekend. A bouquet bought on autopilot, handed over like a receipt. None of it unkind, just unseeing. The discovery landed like a whisper. Love does not maintain itself. It never has. It asks for tending, and the asking can sound at first like criticism. But it's not. It's a plea for presence. So the tending began, clumsy as new gardeners who only vaguely remember where seeds belong. No declaration, no grand gesture. Just one quiet decision repeated. Notice. Notice him. Notice the line between his eyebrows when he worries. The way his hands hover when searching for the right word. The softness that sneaks into his voice when it's near midnight. Notice how the body tries to say what the mouth can't. If love is a language, then touch is its nearest dialect. And this heart began to study again. A chair was pulled next to his when he scrolled through the day's noise. Instead of a separate couch, there was a shared blanket. Not to solve anything. Simply to say with closeness, here. Coffee was carried to his desk with a silly note tucked under the mug, the kind that makes a day smile from the inside. Dinner slowed down into a ritual, phones face down. Candles lit even on Tuesdays. Answers that required more than fine. The table learned new questions. What surprised you today? Where did you feel most alive? What hurt? What healed? Attention, poured like warm water, seeped into the dry places. At first, nothing dramatic happened. That's the secret of real repair. It's not fire. It's the quiet of careful hands. But gradually the room changed temperature. He started to linger in doorways. Eyes met and actually focused like cameras finding their subject again. Hands reached without asking permission from pride. The house learned to exhale. There is a rediscovery that lives inside simple touch. A palm on a back as two people pass in the kitchen. A forehead leaning into another's shoulder on a long day. A thumb tracing the pulse that says, alive still. Not a performance. A conversation. This heart heard him say I'm trying without any words, just in the way he stood nearer at the sink, in the way he squeezed 3 times before letting go, in the way patience returned to his voice. The body kept a scoreboard of tenderness. The points began to accumulate. Routine, the old thief, became a gift when it was met with attention. The commute, once an absence, turned into a countdown of small plans. A playlist was built together for dull mornings. A list of tell me this when you get home sat next to the salt. He'd bring stories from the world outside. Home would answer with gentleness. A tradition formed of taking the long way back from the grocery store, just to add 10 minutes of side-by-side silence with the windows down. Wind did the talking. Hands did the rest. Forgiveness played its quiet role too. Not the grand, cinematic version, but the everyday mercy that sets down old scorecards and opens the curtains. It's impossible to tend a garden while cataloging last season's weeds. So the ledger went into the trash. When a night misfired, when exhaustion won, when sharp words skittered across the floor, the apology arrived early, and the repair happened before sleep. Pillows were no longer borders, they were invitations. The bed stopped being a place to collapse and became a field to rest in together. The kind where gratitude settles on the skin like night air. Attention rearranged the furniture of the heart. The living room made space for slow dancing during commercials. The refrigerator accumulated proof that effort lived here. Doodles, recipes, a lopsided heart drawn in marker after a storming thundercloud of a day. Books that had once been abandoned on end tables now lay open with 2 bookmarks. A conversation waiting on every page. Even chores took on the shape of companionship. Folded shirts turned from tasks into small love letters. The dryer's hum sounded like home. One evening, the kind where soft rain plays percussion on the roof, candles licked at their wicks as dinner cooled. He arrived with his jaw set, a day that had not been kind tucked behind his eyes. Instead of retreat, there was a chair pulled back, a knee touched under the table, a question left open for as long as it took to answer. The story came in pieces, slow and careful. No advice. Just listening and the sort of held gaze that says, every version of you is welcome here. Something uncoiled in the room. He reached across the table with both hands, like someone remembering a path in the dark, and returned to a place he had never left but had forgotten how to enter. That's how it happened over and over, until forgetting how to enter was no longer a risk. This house didn't change neighborhood or paint color. The change was interior. Love became less like drama and more like devotion. Less like fireworks and more like hearth. The spark never left. Sparks can be faithful when sheltered from the wind. Passion returned not as noise but as nearness, as a breath shared in the doorway, as a laugh that starts in the eyes and tumbles into the chest, as a hand tracing a familiar map and still finding new roads. People say marriage kills romance. Maybe it kills the unsustainable kind, the kind that expects desire to break its own bread. But romance that grows up learns to cook, set the table and stay. It learns that flowers are lovely, but water is life. It learns that curiosity is sexy, that kindness is foreplay, that trust is more intoxicating than any feverish chase. It learns that time is not the enemy. Neglect is. There is no clever ending. Only this: distance is not a fate, it is a climate, and climates change when 2 people build a weather system together. Love did not rescue itself. It was tended daily with imperfect hands that refused to stop reaching. Love lives when it is tended. The language of touch was forgotten the way lullabies are, still somewhere inside but quiet from disuse. It used to be fluent. Fingers that once wrote paragraphs along a forearm now rested in pockets. Palms that used to translate breath into safety learned to stay by their sides. Nothing dramatic, just a slow erosion of instinct, the way waves reshape the same shore, day after ordinary day. Then one evening, while stacking plates and pretending the news on the TV could fill the spaces between 2 hearts, a small brave gesture arrived. The back of a hand brushed against a sleeve. It was an accident that wasn't an accident. The body heard it before the mind could give it a caption. Something like still here. Touch, when remembered, is its own alphabet. A shoulder meets a temple. A thumb draws a half moon near a wrist. Knees lean until the air no longer needs to hold the weight of unspoken words. This heart started speaking in that alphabet again, a syllable at a time. The first syllable was proximity. Not clinging. Just choosing the closer cushion, the nearer chair. The side of the street where elbows could graze. The second syllable was slowness. Hands lingered after passing the salt. Fingertips hovered an unnecessary moment when returning a pen. Arms brushed in narrow hallways and neither body hurried to leave the lane. There is a promise in the smallest contact. The promise to try again. Try to listen better. Try to see beyond the armor of routine. Try to remember that love grew here once because 2 people were curious about each other's smallest weather, what storms the eyes had sailed through, What climates the voice carried home. That promise doesn't need a speech. A warm palm across tired knuckles will do. One night, after a long silence around a loud day, a cheek leaned into a hand. The hand did not rescue, it stayed, anchoring steady. The room rearranged around that decision. Touch is honest. It cannot perform for long. When resentment hides in the corners, the body stiffens. When hope returns, shoulders drop half an inch and a breath arrives that wasn't there a second earlier. This heart began measuring progress not in dramatic confessions but in loosened muscles, in the quiet way a back finds the curve of a chest again, in how laughter returned to the skin before it returned to the room. The old, untranslatable tenderness reappeared in everyday grammar. A palm on the spine while passing behind a chair said, "Safe." A finger tracing the lip of a coffee mug while listening said, "Here." An ankle hooked around a calf under a blanket during the late news said, "Don't go." Mornings learn new rituals. The kiss at the door stopped being a stamp and became a sentence, not long but pronounced carefully, each letter clear. "Be gentle out there, come home." The kitchen developed dialects, steam fogging glasses as a face drew close, foreheads greeting in the warm glow of a kettle, a towel tossed playfully over a shoulder and then pulling a body with it, pulling a grin that started in surprise and finished in relief. Even chores felt different when hands touched while reaching for the same plate, when biceps bumped at the sink and no one apologized, when a soapy finger painted a ridiculous heart on a wrist, wiped away and then redrawn. There were setbacks, of course. Days where fatigue spoke louder than love's lexicon. The brain would harden, the mouth would learn that grim line again, and touch would retreat into politeness. Politeness is not the enemy. It's just the foyer. The way back to the living room required patience. Sometimes the only thing possible was placing a hand on his shoulder as he stared into the distance where stress lives, and leaving it there long enough for the body to believe what the mind couldn't. Other times it meant receiving touch without flinching. Letting a hand hold the back of a neck for 3 slow breaths. Letting warmth be smarter than worry. The rediscovery gathered courage in the dark. In the hours when a house falls quiet enough to hear the hinge of the night, feet found each other beneath sheets the way they used to on winter evenings. A secret handshake of toes and soles. A calf crossed over a thigh in wordless surrender to the moment. Hair was tucked behind an ear that didn't need it tucked. And the ear burned with gratefulness anyway. The pulse at the throat became a metronome. The 2 sets of lungs found a shared tempo. The space between skin decided to shorten. If desire was there, it arrived not as spectacle but as meaning. Want, yes, but want braided with gentleness, with the patient curiosity that studies a beloved face as if the years are still not enough to know it. Out in the world, the new language refused to stay home. Grocery aisles became corridors for shy flirtation. Hands grazing as onions were chosen. The smallest lift of the mouth admitting that the produce wasn't the reason for smiling. At red lights, fingers explored the back of a hand as if reading a map previously ignored, tracing roads of veins and childhood scars. Waiting rooms transformed into small sanctuaries where thighs pressed together lightly, saying, "Whatever happens, together." In crowds, an arm always found a waist. In stairwells, a palm always hovered an inch behind a descending shoulder blade. A bodyguard of tenderness. There was a night when old fear returned. The irrational one that whispers love is finite and mistakes waste it. Words were clumsy, solutions were scarce. So touch translated. Knees touched first, tentative diplomats. Then foreheads rested. A bridge built of bone and trust. Tears found the hollow at the base of a neck and were welcomed there without hurry. Fingers threaded, not demanding, only interlacing, and the grip tightened in pulses that said, over and over, the same sentence, trying, trying, trying. The storm did not end because of this, but the house felt less alone in it. With time, the vocabulary expanded. There were playful dialects. Hips bumped during dishwashing, an exaggerated bow in the back of a hand kissed in the entryway after trash duty, a silly dance that required hands in the air and laughter spilling out like beads. There were reverent dialects, hands held during prayerful quiet, a thumb smoothing the brow before sleep like a benediction, a rub at the base of the skull after a hard day, slow and attentive, each circle a way of saying, "I see what you carry." And there were ordinary dialects, the squeeze at the grocery checkout, the 2-tap signal while passing each other with laundry baskets, the steadying palm at the small of the back while crossing a busy street. The body remembers what the heart practices. Muscle memory formed around loving acts the way a musician's hands know the instrument. Reach, linger, breathe. Half the misunderstandings dissolved in those 3 steps. When frustration erupted, the ritual remained. Pause, step close, find a shoulder, hold. Sometimes the holding lasted longer than the argument. Arguments go quiet when held that way. Not silenced but softened into solvable puzzles. The point stopped being winning. The point became touchable truth. What surprised most was how quickly touch made the eyes fluent again. Sight changes when hands lead. The face once glanced at like a familiar picture became a living landscape. The scar near the jaw became a story asked for and learned. The way one eyelid drooped during late-night movies became a private delight. Seeing invited praising, and praising invited more touch, and a good loop spun itself into the days. Touch, see, praise, repeat. Gratitude grew not as a practice scribbled in a notebook, but as heat between palms. People talk about chemistry as if it's fireworks. Fireworks are loud, brief, and require distance for safety. The better metaphor is candlelight. Steady, warm, transforming everything within reach into something worth looking at. Candles, like romance, need tending. A hand protects the flame when drafts sneak in. A match is struck again if the wick sputters. There is skill involved. There is devotion involved. The rediscovery of touch taught that intimacy isn't an accident. It's an art. Imperfect, evolving, forgiven often, but art nonetheless. Some nights, while the world outside insists on urgency, 2 bodies move at the speed of trust. Breaths align, fingertips map the journey from shoulder to wrist like pilgrims returning to a sanctuary. And the old, breathless thrill returns. Matured now, quieter but deeper, saturated with history. Not hunger alone but blessing. Not conquest but communion. The moments after are not absence but fullness. Silence stops feeling empty because the skin is still speaking. The heartbeat is still answering. The room is still warm with yes. This is what trying again looks like when hands mean it. Not the chase of novelty but the reverence of knowing. The promise lives not only in vows spoken once before an audience, but in 1,000 small contacts witnessed only by the lamp and the night. The rediscovered language keeps teaching lessons forgotten in the rush. How a back rub can move grief, how a palm to the chest can slow panic, how a kiss to the forehead can rebuild a day that fell apart, how a simple sacred holding can make 2 people brave without any speeches. Touch spoke. Love understood. Routine had become a quiet country with no landmarks, a map traced so often the paper thinned beneath the fingers. Days looped, the same kettle singing in the same corner, the same slippers parked beside the same bed, the same words exchanged at the same doorway. There was comfort in it, but also a kind of blindness. Repetition can turn miracles invisible. The warmth of his presence had slowly faded into background noise, like the hum of a refrigerator, necessary, constant, unnoticed. And yet, without realizing it, a heart kept listening for a different note, the one that used to make the air inside the house shimmer. It began on a Sunday that felt like any other. The clock on the wall had given up years ago, but no one cared enough to fix it because the phones worked fine. He was sitting by the window, the morning light softening the lines around his eyes. The paper rustled. Coffee steam drifted. Nothing special. Yet for some reason that sight held attention. The sun caught the silver in his hair, and the simple act of him turning a page looked almost like reverence. There was something holy about watching someone be ordinary so completely. The chest tightened. Not from sadness but recognition. Love had not disappeared. It had simply grown quieter than memory knew how to listen for. After that, small things started catching light. The way his hand reached automatically to steady a shoulder when crossing the kitchen. The habit of adjusting the blanket every night, even if half asleep. The sound of his humming when the radio wasn't even on. None of it new. All of it unnoticed until now. There was a shift happening. Not a dramatic one, just a soft refocusing. As if eyes that had been dulled by years of sameness were learning to see again. Routine, it turned out, had not killed magic. It had hidden it in plain sight. Evenings became the classroom for rediscovery. Dinner wasn't a grand affair. Just 2 plates mismatched, the table a little cluttered. But when the clinking of forks met the low hum of the ceiling fan, a rhythm formed. Chew, breathe, glance, smile. The music of an ordinary life. No need for deep conversation or declarations. Sometimes silence spoke more than words could. In that shared quiet, the space between breaths felt like a secret language, the comfort of knowing someone so well that talking became optional. Love in its mature form, not fireworks but steady flame. It was strange how everything mundane began to glow when looked at through gratitude instead of expectation. Folding laundry became a duet of laughter and small teases about mismatched socks. Grocery trips turned into adventures in choosing fruit too carefully just to prolong the walk down the aisles. Even washing dishes became a kind of slow dance, passing plates, bumping shoulders, dripping water running down wrists and being wiped away by a towel that somehow found both hands at once. There was no performance, no grand attempt to resurrect passion. It was already there, disguised as routine. One night, electricity flickered out. The house went dark except for the thin halo of moonlight slipping through the curtains. The usual reaction would have been annoyance, but instead, candles were lit, one by one, until the room looked like it was breathing. He sat on the floor, back against the couch, eyes reflecting the amber flame. For a long time, neither said anything. There was no need. The silence was not empty. It was alive. Every crackle of the wick, every exhale, every heartbeat seemed to join in some quiet ceremony. In that moment it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The air between them pulsed with calm, not passion's rush but peace's depth. Days after, that candlelit moment became a quiet compass. Whenever the noise of life rose, emails, chores, tiredness, it offered a way back. The way back was never dramatic, it was just remembering to notice. Notice how two mugs clinked differently when both hands were warm around them. Notice how his laughter, though rarer now, had mellowed into something richer, like an old song remixed by time. Notice how even the arguments softened quicker, how apologies came sooner, how forgiveness settled easier. The house had not changed. The hearts inside had started breathing in sync again. Breathing together, there was something miraculous in that. Once it used to be about matching pace. Racing hearts, rapid excitement, endless firsts. Now it was about stillness. Lying side by side, eyes half closed, simply existing in the same quiet air. A sigh here, a whisper there, but mostly the shared rhythm of inhaling and exhaling, of being fully present without needing to fill the silence. The heart learned that intimacy isn't always heat. Sometimes it's just warmth that refuses to leave. That was the revelation. Love does not need to be loud to be alive. On mornings when sleep lingered, the world outside already busy, there was a slow turning toward each other before rising. A palm rested on a shoulder, a leg brushed another under the blanket, and neither moved to end it. The body remembered what the mind had forgotten. That safety can feel like skin against skin without demand. That belonging can whisper instead of shout. Even the small ritual of making tea together became a meditation. The kettle sang. One poured, the other stirred. Steam rose between them, carrying forgiveness for every forgotten thank you, every impatient sigh. This was not a love of grand gestures but of steady ones, the kind that endures. There were still hard days. Days when tempers sparked, when silence turned sharp instead of soft. But even then, the new understanding lingered underneath. The knowing that love isn't measured by harmony but by return. They always found their way back. Sometimes through a shared joke, sometimes through the brush of a hand, sometimes through just standing side by side at the window watching rain bead down the glass. Return became its own vow. Friends would ask if marriage felt different after so many years. The answer always began with a smile that carried more truth than words could. Different, yes. Quieter. Deeper. The romance that once burned like a wildfire now glowed like embers. Steady, dependable, capable of warming a lifetime. The kind of love that doesn't demand constant proof but gives it anyway, in 100 small ways each day. It lives in how the shoes at the doorway point toward each other, how dinner is always enough for two, how even in disagreement the tone softens before it breaks. The revelation was not in some new discovery, but in remembering what had been there all along. The warmth of home wasn't the walls or the furniture. It was the pulse of two lives woven into the same rhythm, learning, after all this time, how to breathe together again. Love was never lost. It had simply been waiting for attention, for someone to look around the familiar room and finally see how beautiful it still was. And in that seeing, love began again, quietly, gently, as if it had never left at all. Time did not steal love. It simply changed its handwriting. In the beginning, everything was written in exclamation points. Laughter spilling over the edge of every sentence, hearts racing, hands trembling just to touch. But years have a way of teaching a softer grammar. They round the corners of passion until it fits perfectly in the palm. What once shouted becomes a whisper that somehow means more. The pulse of love slows, but it deepens, settling into the bones where no one can see it, but both can feel it. The early days were fireworks, color, noise, the dizzy thrill of discovering another heartbeat so close that it seemed impossible to ever lose rhythm. Every word felt like music, every silence like promise. But life, as it does, brought its ordinary patterns. Bills, deadlines, illnesses, days that were too short and nights that were too long. Passion didn't vanish, it learned to hide beneath the surface. There were years when love didn't look like roses. It looked like a hand on a shoulder during loss, a meal waiting after a hard day, a blanket adjusted at 2 in the morning. Those gestures spoke louder than declarations. Words became unnecessary because the language between two hearts no longer needed translation. There was one winter when the world outside seemed to echo the quiet within. Snow pressed against the windows, muffling sound. He sat reading by the dim light of a lamp that had outlived its beauty, glasses slipping down his nose, the steam from his tea curling like smoke around his face. Watching him, it struck how much gentler love had become. Not the fevered need of youth, but something steadier, like gravity. The body no longer sought sparks, it sought warmth. The kind that endures, not the kind that burns. It wasn't that the fire was gone. It had moved inward, glowing behind every glance, every small act of care. Sometimes silence said everything. Sitting together in the evening with nothing but the hum of the heater and the slow rhythm of breathing in sync felt fuller than any conversation. There was a depth in that wordlessness, a certainty that didn't need affirmation. Years of shared laughter, fights, forgiveness, and compromise had woven an invisible thread strong enough to hold even when the world seemed to pull apart. Love had turned into something wiser, a quiet knowing that nothing fragile could have lasted this long. Memory played its tricks sometimes. There would be moments when a song from the early years slipped through a radio and instantly rewound the clock. Eyes would meet, both recognizing the echo of who they once were. He would grin, that same crooked grin that once made the world spin faster, and for a heartbeat time folded. The difference now was that the rush no longer needed to be chased. The thrill was in the recognition, in knowing that what once was a spark had become a steady flame that refused to die. The years brought change, lines around eyes, softer bodies, slower steps, but they also brought something else: tenderness. The kind that comes from seeing each other at every stage and staying anyway. Love, tested by time, became less about perfection and more about presence. There was no pretending, no performance left. The comfort of being fully known replaced the old excitement of being newly discovered. It was better this way. It was real. One evening, illness crept in quietly, as unwelcome as a shadow stretching too far. Days blurred into hospital visits, medication schedules, and long nights that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Through it all, his hand never let go. When words became difficult, when fatigue took its toll, the language of touch spoke for both. A squeeze meant, "I'm here." A stroke of the thumb meant, "Don't be afraid." The silence, once filled with uncertainty, now carried devotion so pure it hurt to breathe. It was there, in that fragile space between life's uncertainty and love's insistence, that the depth of their connection revealed itself. Love didn't weaken under pressure. It crystallized, unbreakable. After recovery came the quiet gratitude of second chances. Mornings were slower, coffee shared in bed, laughter over nothing, eyes lingering longer. Gratitude became the rhythm of their days. They learned that love after fear is deeper than love after lust. It's grateful, reverent. Every moment felt like a prayer answered softly. Even the ordinary became sacred. Folding laundry together, taking slow walks, watching sunsets in silence. Each moment carried weight, meaning stitched into its edges. Passion, the old familiar fire, never disappeared. It returned differently, wiser in its hunger. A glance across a room could still light the heart, but it wasn't urgency anymore. It was awe. Awe that after everything, time, change, trials, the pull between them still hummed beneath the skin. When fingers intertwined, the fit was perfect, like a melody remembered even after years of silence. The heartbeat that once raced now resonated. It wasn't the same as before, it was better. Passion had learned to speak the language of peace. Friends often asked how it was possible to stay so close, so in love after so many years. The answer couldn't be explained, it had to be felt. Love had become less about trying and more about being. It wasn't a choice repeated daily. It was simply the air they both breathed. Years had stripped away everything unnecessary. Ego, expectation, fear. Leaving only truth. And truth, when held long enough, turns into devotion. On one ordinary evening, while sitting together watching the sun dissolve into the horizon, there was a moment where words almost rose but never did. There was nothing to add. His hand rested over hers, light but sure. The pulse beneath skin spoke centuries. They didn't need to say that they loved each other. The space between them already did. The light softened, shadows lengthened, and in that stillness, everything felt infinite. It wasn't about forever, it was about now, about having built something that even silence couldn't undo. Real love doesn't fade. It learns new ways to exist. It softens its voice but strengthens its meaning. It becomes wisdom wearing the face of tenderness. It becomes patience dressed as forgiveness. It becomes laughter that knows sorrow and still chooses joy. Time did not erase it. It sculpted it into something unshakable. A connection not dependent on youth or novelty, but rooted in presence, compassion, and a quiet, enduring fire. And when the night finally comes, when words fall away for good, the love that once spoke through lips will still echo through touch, through memory, through everything left behind. Because love, when it's real, does not end, it transforms. If this story touched something inside you, let it linger, then share it. Subscribe for more journeys of love that endure, heal, and grow deeper with every heartbeat. Like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments and keep believing. Real love doesn't fade, it transforms. Until next time, stay in love.